Last year, a legendary YouTube atheist Paulogia published something of a response to Gary Habermas.
I will say personally, I think this is the best atheist attempt on the internet to answer Gary Habermas's minimal facts case. So I do think that more people need to, address this argument.
I had a couple of fans reach out to me kind of asking about a response video from a popular atheist YouTuber named Paulogia, who has kind of given a counter, kind of an attack on Gary's work on the minimal facts approach.
As a commenter on my blog had apparently seen either Apologia's video or had seen mentions of it on Twitter and had not seen any responses to it.
Because I've had a couple Christians who are worried about this theory from Paulogia.
They're worried about little old me? Welcome to Paulogia.
Going to be on Paulogia too. Just so people know, because I always pronounce his name wrong. I always used to say Paulogia, and now I'm trying to pronounce it the way Paulogia says it. So if I mispronounce your name, I'm sorry.
Where a former Christian takes a look at the claims of Christians.
I haven't listened to, or let's say bothered with, anything from Paulogia in probably a year and a half or something. So I'm not even sure what train he's on right now. But if he's coming back to objecting to resurrection claims, I don't want to be uncharitable, but I feel like he's probably just tugging along a trend so that he can continue having the notoriety of his channel, because it doesn't seem like he's gone anywhere.
It's true. Unlike Christian apologists who barely whisper a peep about the resurrection of Jesus outside of Easter Sunday, I continue to be disproportionately hung up on the apparently unimportant resurrection fad. In fact, today, we're going to be looking at 3 separate videos from Christians, each responding in their own way to videos and articles about my Minimal Witness's naturalistic hypothesis for the origins of Christianity. Don't worry, you don't need to have ever heard of, nor be familiar with, this hypothesis to follow along. Though I'm also going to try to keep the rehashing to a minimum for those who are already familiar. Hopefully we strike a balance. Before these responses came out, I was not familiar with any of these gentlemen. So let's take a minute to let the panelists introduce themselves.
I am Triggerman 1976, and welcome back to the blogcast.
Hello, Triggerman 1976. Based on the self-published novel you can see on screen,
Purchase a copy of my debut action thriller, A Turning of Shadow.
His real name is Jake Cole. So hopefully he won't mind if I call him Jake instead of Triggerman.
Hello and welcome to The Epitome. I'm your host, Nathan Bozeman. Today, we're going to be doing a response to Paulogia, and I'm bringing on a very special guest, my friend, Darwin to Jesus.
Oh, you're using your made-up names. I'm Spider-Man then.
Darwin to Jesus is awkward to say, but throughout the stream, Nathan refers to him as Daniel.
Do you have any comments on that, Daniel? What do you think, Daniel? I think you would agree, Daniel.
So hopefully he won't mind if I call him Daniel.
Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Faith Unaltered.
And here we have Josh Davidson.
With me tonight is our friend from Real Seekers, Dale. How you doing tonight, bud?
Now, astute regular viewers may recognize the name of Dale of Real Seekers as the personal disciple of resurrection scholar Gary Habermas.
As everyone knows, my friend Gary Habermas has just published Volume 1 of his great magnum opus on the resurrection of Jesus.
And the host of the Resurrection Volume 3 launch party stream that I recently critiqued. Thanks to Gary's mentorship, Dale used math to decide that Christianity is true.
I got at 53.14% that Christianity is true.
That seems a little low for something that claims to affect my eternal soul, but okay. Josh and Dale were also joined by someone calling themselves First Last.
First Last, do you have anything to say on this, the presentation, or this minimal witnesses theory?
Or well, no.
All right, fair enough.
Okay.
While these men all seem genuinely and sincerely intelligent and articulate, in this context, I didn't find their particular lines of argumentation to be particularly sophisticated or novel. In fact, taken as a whole, I think they best demonstrate a lot of the common mistakes that I see Christians making in addressing my hypothesis. So I thought it would be helpful to put together this video in order to call attention to the pitfalls so that future Christian responses can potentially avoid them. This first tip is less about the arguments and more about a stylistic choice. In my day-to-day life, I try not to characterize how someone should receive what I'm going to say. I avoid prefacing my tales with, "Do you want to hear a funny story?" or "This is interesting, call me strange." But I think the right to call something funny or interesting belongs to the listener, not the teller. And how does this relate to critiquing an argument?
That's the first thing I wanted to do, is kind of raise and address his minimal witnesses theory and why I think it's an utter failure.
And so I'm really looking forward to debunking this video.
Yeah, I can't say I'm impressed.
And I think the theory just completely fails.
Don't go to people like Paulogia and watch a 20-minute video clip and think that you can refute the resurrection.
I've never seen it done well, and this is not an exception to that. This is the best I've seen, and it's still terrible and completely fails in my view.
My fans of Real Seekers who are worried about Paulogia's response, there's nothing to be worried about. There are so many critiques that one could make about it. So don't be worried about it.
Maybe I don't need to get quite as worked up because I don't think anyone's eternal soul is wrapped up in their conclusions about this. So I don't need to press hyperbolic assurances. I think it's up to your viewers to decide whether my modest proposal concerns them or causes doubts.
The atheist objections, I mean, they just always cast doubt on everything. So I just find I just don't like following their trails because it's just, they just always cast doubt.
That's where you and I differ. I actively seek out voices and opinions that will challenge what I believe, because truth has nothing to fear from doubt. Now you may be thinking, "Hey Paul, didn't you pre-frame the panel's arguments as unsophisticated and mistaken?" Indeed, that's possible. Maybe that was hypocritical. Let me know in the comments.
Now, let me begin by saying that Paul's article was thoughtful. It was well written, and he obviously had put a lot of effort and a lot of thought into it.
Thank you, Jake. Let's get to the first real problem. It may seem obvious, but the first thing a minimal witnesses response video should do is actually include clips of a video where I outline the elements of the hypothesis. I've made several over the years, so you have choices. Or alternatively, one can go to bartehrman.com where I publish an article about it in written form. Nathan decided to go old school.
We're going to be doing a response to Paulogia today on his argument for the resurrection that he did about 6 years ago. And we're going to be, I'll be adding context along the way because I know he's updated it over the years, and we'll be talking a little bit through all of that.
For some reason, he went with my very first video on this, long before I started calling it Minimal Witnesses Hypothesis, despite him being seemingly aware that I have newer versions. But that's all within bounds, I'd say.
It's an older code, sir, but it checks out. I was about to clear them.
And Jake went for the blog, opting to read it himself.
And he published this article over at Bart Ehrman's blog.
So 2 out of 3 are okay. Which option did Dale go with?
There's 4 big names in the early research. You've named everybody but one in our talking here. Peter, James, the brother of Jesus, Paul, and John. They're the 4 most influential Christians probably of all time.
Gary admits he really has only 4 names. Wow. Well, Dale went with the bold choice to play a clip from an unrelated show.
It's a bold strategy, Cotton. Let's see if it pays off for him.
This is from a video called The Live Failure of the World's Best Resurrection Scholar. It's critiquing an interview with Gary and Sean McDowell. Despite having plenty of options, he chose to play a video that does not actually present my witness's case. This is definitely a response fail. To make matters worse, Dale also took the effort to make a slide with a minimal witnesses outline in text. And rather than copy and paste from the written blog, both for ease and to ensure that he's representing me correctly, instead he's chosen the path of extra effort to rework, renumber, and rephrase me. For example, I posit a sequence of 12 mundane events, which I do not call facts, as he's labeled them, and he's somehow reduced the number to 7. Dale could have easily presented my argument in my own words so as to refute my actual thoughts. Instead, he went out of his way to present a less daunting version. This is a great example of how not to refute an argument. Of course, it's not enough to faithfully present an argument. One needs to understand what a theory is attempting to explain in order to know how to evaluate how well or poorly it succeeds in explaining. For example, The test of biological evolution is how well it explains the diversity of life. To evaluate evolution based on how well it explains the origin of self-replicating molecules, or whether it can be applied as social policy, would be missing the point. One critiques game theory on how well it predicts or suggests strategic decision-making in competitive and cooperative scenarios. It is not a failure of game theory that people keep playing Monopoly despite it always ending in tears. So, what is minimal witnesses hypothesis attempting to account for? To account for the established history of Christianity, and indeed, Gary Habermas's minimal facts. If you look at that on the page, you can see the established history of Christianity is the main point, and Gary Habermas's minimal facts is in parentheses, indicating that it's an aside or a subset. All three panelists picked up on the Gary Habermas minimal facts part.
Popular atheist YouTuber named Paulogia, who has kind of given a counter, kind of an attack on Gary's work on the minimal facts approach.
Paul is responding to the outline of a hypothesis that's generally been promoted by Gary Habermas.
From our understanding, is addressing Gary Habermas and his minimal facts.
He's only responding to Gary Habermas's minimal facts, and so he doesn't view gospel reliability as a fact to be explained. And so to him, he doesn't have to account for everything the Gospels say because he's only trying to account for Habermas's facts.
We'll set aside that they're focused on the parenthetical for the moment and roll with their assumption that all I'm trying to do is explain Gary's facts. One would think the first step in evaluating if my hypothesis indeed answers Gary's facts is knowing what Gary's facts are.
So Gary Habermas says that there are certain things that are agreed upon by virtually all scholars or a high majority of scholars. So things like that the early Christians were martyred, I think is a fact.
No, martyrdom is not one of Gary's facts.
And that they said that Jesus Christ rose from the dead is, I think, one of the minimal facts.
Kind of, but not really. This seems like something you could look up before a live stream about whether an argument accounts for said facts. You might even prepare some slides, like Dale, who is sure to know exactly what facts his personal friend Gary Habermas puts forth. See, this slide is titled Gary Habermas's Minimal Facts, so this will surely be accurate.
Well, so here's Gary Habermas's minimal facts, right? So he's got about 6, or his extended list is a total of 12 minimal facts, right? So Jesus died by crucifixion. He was buried in a private tomb, or the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea. The disciples were discouraged, bereaved, despondent afterwards.
Nope, those are not Gary's minimal facts, despite the title. I know that part of the book very well. But also, I recognize this frame grab from my own video. You know, the one he played the clip from, in a section where I'm pointing out how Gary's book never defends group appearances. But if we open up Gary's book to his full list of his extended 12 quasi-facts, none of these even watered-down facts to be explained claim group experiences per Gary. I was belittling the list as watered-down quasi-facts because it's not the list Gary defends or claims that scholars would affirm, and indeed, they would not. Gary's actual minimal facts list happened to be behind me on this frame grab. The extended list he's referring to is just an unsupported wish list.
I think his minimal facts as of right now are, number 1, Jesus was crucified. Number 2, the apostles had experiences that they interpreted as Jesus being risen from the dead. 3, they started preaching about the resurrection of Jesus pretty early after the crucifixion. I want to say number 4 is the conversion of Paul. Number 5 is the conversion of James. I might be missing one, but that's all off the top of my head. So
close enough, I guess. But it would have been easy to have the list handy and not go off the top of your head. You missed Gary's third fact. These experiences accounted for the disciples' lives becoming thoroughly transformed, even to the point of being willing to die for their belief. Though now, thanks to Dale playing the wrong video, I can remind everyone of Gary's tacit admission that 2 of his facts are overreaches.
There's 4 big names in the early research. You've named everybody but one in our talking here. Peter, James, the brother of Jesus, Paul, and John. They're the foremost influential Christians probably of all time.
Gary admits He really has only four names. James, brother of Jesus, James, brother of Jesus, But remember that Paul and James each have their own separate number 5 and number 6 on Gary's list. So the only two names he can attach to having experiences and being willing to die are Peter and John. Facts number 2 and 3 should actually read Peter and John afterward reported these experiences that they thought were actually by the risen Jesus. And these experiences accounted for Peter and John's lives becoming thoroughly transformed, even to the point of being willing to die for their belief. Whether or not you think it works, Minimal Witnesses accounts for Peter and John becoming church pillars. So these are handled when properly clarified. In fact, there seems to be some sentiment that Minimal Witnesses does indeed account for Gary Habermas's minimal facts, even if they don't think I do it well.
He might technically, in a very technical sense, be fulfilling Gary Habermas's minimal facts. You're maybe technically accounting for the minimal facts. Sure, what Paulogia has provided is an explanation. I might even grant that it does explain all of Gary Habermas's minimal facts.
This is the right idea. Does my hypothesis explain a particular set of facts? Whether another hypothesis explains it better is a separate question. I've yet to have a Christian point out which of the minimal facts I don't account for. So it's nice to have this validation, and could theoretically be the end of Gary Habermas's career, right? I have provided a naturalistic explanation that is sufficient for his criteria. Should be the end of discussion on that front. One of the panelists did notice that my claims are slightly more audacious than merely Gary's minimal facts.
So right there, he says, in order to account for the established history of Christianity, but he's literally glossing over the established history of Christianity, except for the facts that he wants to discuss. So if you're going to say you're accounting for the established history of Christianity, okay, well, you really failed now, because I thought that you were just talking about Gary Habermas's minimal facts. But if you want to talk about the established history of Christianity, now you have to grant the Gospels.
No, I'm sorry. The accuracy of the Gospels is not an established fact of Christianity. It is merely a widely held opinion, despite compelling counter evidence. I'm not defending any opinions, only facts. Here they are. Proto-Christianity emerged in the 1st century. Letters attributed to Paul circulated among early congregations. Written narratives about Jesus and his followers were created and distributed. Over 2.5 billion people currently identify as Christian. These are what facts look like. I've come across no one who disputes them. Way higher than Gary's standard of 90% acceptance. Supplemental embellishments like an empty tomb, group appearances, and suffering of other witnesses are not facts to be explained, but mere story artifacts of the legendary development described above. Having to concede that the hypothesis does explain the dataset it intends to, the apologists instead move the goalposts in a way that makes the entire discussion pointless.
The minimal facts is not the entire discussion. Maybe Habermas approaches it that way, but to me, that's not the best way the argument should be ran.
So it's one thing to account for minimal facts, and these are just facts that are widely agreed upon, but there are other facts that we would say are also relevant.
And what exactly are these facts that I'm not accounting for?
I am left to resort to the primary sources, the Gospels, to establish the facts.
I'm sorry, what? The Gospels establish facts?
I think this is totally ridiculous. In the first place, this theory directly contradicts the Gospel of John and its resurrection appearances.
Yes. Every possible naturalistic explanation for the origins of Christianity must necessarily contradict the Gospels, because the Gospels contain supernatural elements. This is entirely unavoidable. Pointing out that a naturalistic explanation contradicts the Gospels is not actually a critique of any kind.
In order to overcome the evidence from our primary sources, the Gospels, it is contingent upon the person making the claim to provide direct testimonial evidence to the contrary.
This wrongfully reverses the burden of proof. The burden is on the person making the positive claim to establish its credibility, not on others to disprove it. Requiring direct testimony evidence to the contrary is historically naive. If someone questions Julius Caesar's divinity, do they need first-century direct testimony of someone saying he wasn't a god? Where are the witnesses that Muhammad didn't get a revelation from the angel Gabriel? Much of historical revision or skepticism comes from indirect evidence, like contradictions, literary analysis, cultural context, anachronisms, or psychological plausibility, not rival eyewitnesses.
This is also why it's not enough, Paulogia, to merely respond to Gary Habermas's minimal facts. It is not enough. You have to explain all the relevant data. And he's going to want to say, oh, you're just saying for the Bible tells me so and all this stuff. No, we're not. I'm not assuming that the Bible is inspired in making these arguments.
If the fault you're finding with my hypothesis is that it contradicts something in the Bible, then you're absolutely engaging in your view on inspiration or inerrancy doesn't create a nuance that makes this not the case. Let's try a different example to see if you can see the problem. Suppose you're a scientist investigating alien abduction stories. Rather than view them as evidence of extraterrestrial visitation, you propose that they're better explained by a convergence of psychological, sociological, and neurological factors. Many accounts are consistent with the experience of sleep paralysis, a state that can induce terrifying hallucinations, a sense of presence, and physical immobilization. Psychologists also point to the creation of false memories, which can be influenced by suggestive therapeutic techniques like hypnosis and a person's own fantasy proneness. These personal experiences are often molded by a powerful cultural script, established and reinforced by media portrayals that provide a ready-made narrative for interpreting unusual and frightening events. You view the abduction phenomenon not as a hoax, but as a complex interplay between the human mind and pervasive cultural narratives, rather than a literal encounter with aliens. To this, an alien believer shouts back, "Nuh-uh, this contradicts that Brandine says she was on a spacecraft." Would you really consider that a serious critique? No, you'd bang your head on a desk because the alien believer wasn't paying attention. It may or may not do so well in your opinion, but the scientific proposal clearly accounts for reports of non-veridical experiences. So too, minimal witnesses. It is a fact that Gospels exist. It is not a fact that they actually represent reality, but particularly on its supernatural claim. Minimal Witnesses explains very reasonably, in fact, very much in line with modern scholarship, how inaccurate Gospels can exist. If the reliability of the Gospels could be defended as a fact, Habermas would do it. The entire reason he came up with minimal facts was to attempt to sway the scholarly community who reject gospel reliability.
And he's really pretending like a lot of these facts are not even facts.
I'm not pretending they're not facts by any reasonable definition. Gospel reliability is not a fact to be explained, but merely an opinion to be held, a highly contested opinion. If you think that gospel reliability is a fact, then spend all your energy proving that gospel reliability is a fact, and then all naturalistic theories will just go away. They couldn't even exist. You definitely wouldn't need to waste your time responding to them, and no one in your audience would be worried about them. Gospel reliability is an opinion. That it's a popular opinion in your circles doesn't somehow elevate it to fact. Until then, accurate gospels were written, and inaccurate gospels were written, are both sufficient possible causes for the existence of gospels, which is the only fact in play. All right, that's the main problem to avoid. Your belief that the supernatural claims and theological polemics are true is of no consequence to the ability of minimal witnesses to explain the universally accepted data. But while we're here, let's run through some of the panelist commentary on the 12 mundane events to see these pitfalls in action and some other hang-ups to avoid in the future. 1. In the early 1st century, among the apocalyptic preachers active in Judea was one Jesus of Nazareth.
One thing I will do is I will give praise to Paul in the fact that he does affirm the fact that Jesus is a historical person. That way he doesn't sound like a complete loon.
Most Christians are willing to just passively agree with me and not waste time. This point is primarily here to differentiate from mythicism, and for me to have to justify myself to atheists. But some responders feel the need to do a full court press.
So in some sense, this statement can best be described as misleading at worst or unclear at best. But however one takes it, it could be considered, at least technically, uncontroversial.
That was essentially empty calorie time filler to hedge why he agrees with the filthy atheist. Just take the win. 2. This Jesus said, or did, controversial things which led to his crucifixion on a cross, a common practice at the time.
So he basically just said, that Jesus was crucified. No disagreements there.
Paulogia, just to summarize, he admits, look, Jesus died by Roman crucifixion. I don't have a problem with that fact.
Here again, we run into a problem, as this could be described as either misleading or overly simplistic. Because while it was true that the Roman government of Judea actually committed the deed, they only acted at the behest of the Jewish authorities. In fact, this is what our primary historical sources contend. You know those historic primary sources? The Gospels?
I didn't specify who killed him, just that he was killed. This point is a fight with Muslims and atheists. It's not supposed to be with Christians. Again, take the win and save the outrage for where the real battles lie. Like this one.
3. The resting place of Jesus' body was unknown to his followers.
So my way of assessing the minimal witnesses, in the first place, his theory, even if taken at face value, and I grant everything, he can't explain the empty tomb. So he has to deny that as a historical fact. And the problem is we have good evidence for the empty tomb.
Well, no. If you grant everything, then you grant that Jesus' followers didn't know where his body was. So there would be no empty tomb. See how it's accounted for?
Paul appeals to a few sources to establish a number of assertions regarding the possible disposal of the body of Jesus. My chief complaint is that Enns is horrible at citing his sources. So I am left to resort to the primary sources, the Gospels, to establish the facts.
The strict word count I was given on the article included the citations, so I couldn't put everything in I wanted to. But this section does include 4 of my sources. But it doesn't actually seem this is what Jake has a problem with. He's upset that I left out his personal favorite book.
They have to provide actual documentary evidence to the facts. You cannot appeal to any practices or appeal to or make inference from those supposed policies. It is necessary to prevent direct evidence that addresses the claim.
Plato says that Atlantis was a powerful island nation that disappeared into the depths of the sea. Do I need to have a chorus of historians specifically telling me that Atlantis didn't sink in order to doubt Plato's single source claim? Or is it enough for me to doubt on the basis of no corroboration from any historian or archaeologist that this was ever even a real place? By Jake's criteria, he must believe in Atlantis. Jake wants me to have a competing book where someone writes, neither I nor anyone else knows where Jesus' body went, as if that's something a first century person would reasonably write, that ancient scribes would preserve, or that he would give any credence even if they did. Again, Jake doesn't seem to understand burden of proof or hypotheticals. My very reasonable question is, if we don't go in just assuming the gospel story is true, what does history tell us would happen to a crucifixion victim? If you're uncomfortable with hypotheticals about Jesus, think about what would have happened to the bodies of the thieves said to be crucified next to Jesus. What happened to them?
Apologists often focus on the timing of Jesus' body's removal. But the crucial question is who disposed of it? If the Romans were responsible, the body would have been left on the cross, possibly to be eaten by animals, as this humiliation was considered part of the punishment.
Just to give everybody a little background knowledge, is outside of Judea. So everywhere else in the Roman Empire, outside of Judea, it was the common practice for a crucified victim to either stay on the cross and basically rot, because the humiliation was a part of the that's kind of like a part of the death. It was about the humiliation and the shame as well, because they're in a shame, honor and shame culture. And so basically he's wanting to say it's the standard practice in the Roman Empire for the crucified victim to either stay on the cross and rot.
I'm not just wanting to say it. Standard Roman practice was to continue the humiliation and leave the bodies hanging. Sources are plentiful, and I've never heard a historian deny this. Nathan qualifies outside of Judea, but this is merely a possibility, not an evidenced conclusion. Imagine archaeologists in the year 4025 discovering a copy of the U.S. Constitution alongside evidence that the Second Amendment permitted gun ownership across the Republic during the 20th century. If one historian then argued that Massachusetts was exempt from this amendment based solely on unearthed articles showing that local citizens disliked firearms, their colleagues would reasonably conclude that federal law still applied despite local sentiment. The burden of proof lies with whoever is claiming an exception to established law.
The argument that Paulogia is making is that this is something that was done in most of the kingdom, and therefore we should think that it was done here in Judea, and that simply doesn't follow. It doesn't follow that there weren't any exceptions.
I agree. Maybe there were exceptions, but the burden of proof remains on the person claiming the exception.
Judea is the province in the Roman Empire where Jerusalem is, where the temple is. So there's going to be this very specific subculture inside of Judea that isn't going to match anywhere else in the Roman Empire. And so, first of all, I just want to say, I don't think it's going to be surprising that we might find some unique practices particular to Judaism in the province of Judea. So I'm not going to say that that's enough to establish the burden of proof, but I just want to give that as a topologia, as something to think about.
I have indeed thought about it extensively, studied it extensively, and remain unconvinced that Rome made exceptions simply because Jewish people didn't like it.
We have a quote from Josephus in his book, Wars of the Jews, and it says this: "Nay, they proceeded to the degree of impiety as to cast away their dead bodies without burial, although the Jews used to take so much care of the burial of men that they took down those who were condemned and crucified and buried them before the going down of the sun."
Josephus is an interesting historian because he was born Jewish, but was captured and defected to Rome, who then employed him to write Jewish history. Throughout his works, you can see him trying to rehabilitate the Jewish reputation with his Roman patrons. This passage is a perfect example. He contrasts the moral failures of radical rebels who seized Jerusalem with the good traditional Jewish values, using burial preferences to highlight positive traditions. The context of this isn't policy declaration, but reputation management.
Just because there is a general rule, that doesn't mean that there are no exceptions. And obviously, if Jesus was buried, then he was an exception. And it doesn't follow that here's this thing that normally happens, therefore it happens in all cases. So he's making a bad argument there.
But it's not my argument that it happens in all cases. My case doesn't rely on no exceptions. I go through the whole list of options of who might have dealt with Jesus' body. And if Romans took charge of the body, it would have ended up somewhere unknown to his followers. I'm aware of no historian, even apologists, who disputes this. While I'm unconvinced of an exception, for historical reasons too numerous to dive into here, notice that I continue on, granting this possibility for the sake of argument.
If a Judean religious exemption existed, despite explicit records to the contrary regarding Jesus' case of treason, the responsibility would have fallen to the family to successfully petition those in power. In the absence of family, the priesthood would have taken charge. However, Jewish law mandated that criminals be left in a separate, designated graveyards of the condemned in a dishonorable and secretive manner.
Or if the Sanhedrin was to take Jesus off the cross, they would have buried him in like a mass grave somewhere because he was put to shame, and so he would not receive an honorable burial.
You did notice, but you didn't or couldn't dispute the reality of this scenario either.
In the expected scenarios, the location of Jesus' body remains unknown. For it to be otherwise would require the same authorities who condemned Jesus to honor him mere hours later, a notion nearly as implausible as a resurrection.
And so basically what Paulogia wants to say is, well, there you go. It's the common practice. Now it's on you, Christians. The burden of proof is on you to show why I should believe that Jesus in his burial is actually a historical thing.
Exactly. The problematic Joseph of Arimathea story is found exclusively in the literarily dependent, therefore not independent, Gospels.
Of course, the response might be, well, that there's an alleged relationship between some of the sources, specifically the synoptics, that potentially whittles down the sources to two.
So it'd be too quick to say, oh, the burial's mentioned in, all four Gospels, therefore four sources. What we would say is Mark is a source, and then John is said to be written independently of Matthew and Luke. So John would be a second source.
It's getting harder and harder to find a serious scholar who would say with a straight face that the author of John was unaware of the other Gospels. Given the arguments Christians want to make about the close-knit community and the early circulation and apostolic fact-checking, this is entirely implausible.
And Paulogia, if you ever see this, I want to say, you need to account for all this evidence. I don't think you can just say, oh, well, it's not one of Habermas's facts, so I don't have to account for it. It's just a legend. It's just something that was made up. All of this day, there is so much evidence in favor of this not being a legend. Just throwing these facts away because they're not minimal facts, I just don't think that's going to work at all.
I reject it because the evidence is bad, not because Gary rejects it. Despite apologetic distractions, the Joseph of Arimathea story is entirely... I promise you this, if Gary could get away with calling it a fact, he would call it a fact, but he can't do it without completely shattering his scholarly credibility facade. First convince Gary, then come talk to me. Convince non-evangelical scholarship that the Gospels are reliable, and this whole discussion goes away.
4. This Jesus had some followers while he was alive, but most disappeared into lives never recorded by reliable history, never to be heard from again, all except Simon Peter and possibly John.
Dale's amusing initial reaction here is that he thinks we have evidence for 3 instead of 2, as if that would change the point.
This is just total BS, because we can actually prove minimally 3 people, because don't forget, we have Acts of the Apostles talking about James, the son of Zebedee, not James, the brother of the Lord, but the brother of John here.
Which Dale already knows I reject, because
Paulogia rejects the accounts of James, the son of Zebedee, because it's only recorded in one source, in Acts.
That's correct. And what's worse is that your Christian scholar friends agree with me.
He basically says, but this evidence for James just comes from Acts. That's one source. And he plays a clip out of context of Sean McDowell saying, oh, well, if it's only in one source, we don't have multiple independent attestation, then we should be more skeptical or something like that. It's down one notch in terms of how much we believe. And
little did Dale know that a few months after this, he'd be personally hosting a PhD party where Sean McDowell would actually credit Gary Habermas for helping him arrive at this conclusion. And Dale would be on screen to watch it happen in context.
I lowered down James, the son of Zebedee, in part because you said you've really got one source as reliable as it is. And I was like, you know what? Gary's right on this one. I think I'm overstating it a little bit, so I lowered that one down.
Seems like I'm in good company.
Paulogia takes this out of context to be saying, well, you see, if we only have one source, we should disbelieve it. It's not a historical fact. And I just want to say that's ridiculous.
If we have just a single source for something, we don't reject it out of hand, but we also don't elevate it to factual status, unless you also consider it a fact that the civilization of Atlantis sunk into the ocean. But Dale's not done. Remember that he's the guy who did the math and became a Christian because he calculated that it was 53% likely. Well, it seems he thinks disciple counting should also have just a 50% standard.
In my case, when I was arguing for the resurrection, my argument, I didn't have to prove that all of the 12 disciples had resurrection appearances. It was sufficient so long as I could say that most of them, 6 out of the 11, if I could prove 6 out of the 11 had a resurrection appearance, that was sufficient for my argument.
Hey, if you could prove 6 of 11, I agree that'd be something. Where's the proof?
If we do want to prove that a majority and or all of the 12 did in fact have resurrection appearances, in terms of the records, everything supports that, yes, they never recanted. They stayed a part of the 12. They believed in the resurrection as apostles and were continuing on in the ministry. We have no records or evidence at all that says any one of them outside of Judas recanted or that they, disappeared from history. That this just doesn't make sense.
No one recanted is an argument from silence. I can equally point out that there's no record of any of them being given a chance to recant. This silence tells us nothing at all about whether they did or did not continue on with the Jesus movement. We also don't need history to tell us who disappeared from history. We can just look at the history and see who's there and who isn't. Anyone who isn't there has disappeared from history.
And Paulogia, he relies on this historically implausible notion that the disciples, they dispersed. They just quote unquote disappeared from history. I'm sorry, that doesn't work. People don't disappear like magicians in real life.
It's tough to take you seriously when you say things like that. Mary's husband Joseph disappeared from history. Cleopas, one of the disciples on the road to Emmaus, said to have seen risen Jesus, disappeared from history. Nicodemus, said to have helped bury Jesus, disappeared from history. Mary Magdalene disappeared from history. All that means is that no reliable source documented their activities after the death of Jesus. It's not invoking magic or creating a conspiracy or casting dispersions on the Gospels. It's just a fact that we have no reliable record of what they did. The same is true of 9 of the 12. I don't know upon what you're basing your insistence that you know what happened to people after history stopped writing about them, but it isn't history.
If even one of them did recant, I would argue we would expect to have evidence, just as we have with Judas, right? They need to explain, Judas did this and this is why he did this, or, kind of make sense of it. So if Thomas recanted, you think that like he just went off to Galilee, Peter came back to Galilee and told them, hey, I saw the risen Jesus. Thomas said, get out of here, Peter. That would be preserved. We would expect that to be preserved and explained away in some way as to why.
Funny enough, it seems like the Gospels actually do preserve and attempt to explain away why some of the 12 weren't active. It's the motif of doubt. In Matthew 28:17, but some doubted. In Luke 24:11, they did not believe them. And later in the chapter, dismissing Jesus as a ghost. In John 20, we have doubting Thomas. In the long ending of Mark, the disciples don't believe Mary Magdalene, and Jesus rebukes them for it. Scholars like Dale Allison, James D.G. Gunn, James Tabor, and Bart Ehrman all contend this could be exactly what you said, a preserved attempt to explain away any legitimate reports that some of the disciples didn't actually carry on in the Jesus movement.
He's saying all of the members of the 12, with the exception of Peter and John, just renounced Jesus after his death. That would have been preserved. We would expect some historical evidence in some form.
Our first anti-Christian writing is general character smears in the 2nd century by Tacitus, calling it a pernicious superstition, Suetonius, calling it a mischievous sect, and Pliny the Younger, calling it a stubborn superstition. It's not until satirical writer Lucian of Samosata mocked Christians as gullible in The Death of Peregrinus around 165 AD that we finally get specific critique. And then in the 3rd century, we see Origen responding to a critique from Celsus, poking specific holes. But that's the best we have preserved. So my question for Dale is, what 1st century source do we have that he expects would have documented disciples who didn't continue on, but are instead silent on the matter? For all Dale knows, 9 disciples got together every week in the town square and loudly sang a "We Never Saw a Risen Jesus" song for all to hear. This is an argument from silence, and not the kind that has some merit. At this point, I'm still very confused about how silence on recanting is going to add up to Dale's 6 affirming disciples.
That's just historically implausible, this notion that, well, all of the other members of the 12 just disappeared as though they snapped their fingers and ended up in the United States or something like that. That can't be true, right?
Just reiterating his own personal incredulity. Maybe someday he'll explain why this applies to 6, but not to all of them, or how a lack of evidence is evidence. Until then, the real magic trick is how Dale comes to conclusions.
He only focuses his theory on Peter, James, Paul, and John, because he says these are the only ones we have like evidence for, and like all the other apostles just kind of go into obscurity. So he basically wants me to believe that like Philip and Andrew and Matthew and Judas, not Iscariot, or Thomas, and all these guys totally gave up on the movement, just went on and lived their lives again, and only these 3 or 4 guys kept the movement going by themselves.
Yes, to me that is a perfectly valid option for men that are not positively affirmed to be part of the movement. Why is it not?
I just think that's absurd.
Well, it's absurd because of how powerful the movement was.
A powerful movement is reasonable for 12 people, but absurd for 2? I'm curious as to what units of measurement he's assessing this with. Power per disciple? What if Jesus really rose but appeared to only 2 people? Would Christianity have died on the vine due to not enough manpower?
And I don't think that one man who had been disgraced already, his hallucination or his word would be nearly enough to cause such a thing. I think that that's just preposterous. Really stretches the limits of incredulity.
One soul is not equal to another.
Aha! So we've established my proposal is sound in principle, now we're just haggling over price.
So to be clear, starting with 11 men is plausible, but starting with 2 men stretches the limits of credulity. I'd love to hear the science behind these numbers, and would be so sad to find out that it's just intuition and vibes.
5. Distraught after the death of his mentor, Simon Peter became sincerely, albeit mistakenly, convinced that Jesus had appeared to him. While potential causes are innumerable, a post-bereavement hallucinatory experience involving sensory perceptions of a deceased loved one is a likely cause of Peter's mistaken belief.
First up, some psychology objections.
There's a brand new book that just came out. I'm going to show it on screen really quick. So this is called Resurrection, Extraordinary Claim, or Extraordinary Evidence for an Extraordinary Claim by Nick Meter. This is a brand new book. It just came out, and it's based on psychological research. He's also a statistician, so he talks about probability theory and things like that in the book. I'm not totally done with it, but based on what he's saying, a lot of new psychological research is showing that the hallucination theory is not a very good explanation of the facts. So
maybe you should have waited to finish reading it. I've read it. The handful of pages on hallucinations are underwhelming at best, though I agree that Meter personally doesn't like hallucination theory. Look for a more in-depth review here at some point. Does anyone have anything more substantial than holding up a book they didn't finish reading?
Bereavement hallucinations mostly affect young widows between the ages of 30 and 39, and specifically those over 70 years of age are most likely to experience such hallucinations.
True. In Olson and Company's 1985 study, they identified this curvilinear pattern in ages. I'm not sure why Jake might bring this up as a problem, since it's very plausible that Peter was in his 30s at the time Jesus died.
Also, such hallucinations only appear to present when the object is a spouse, a child, or a close relative. In fact, half of all reported incidents of bereavement hallucination involve a subject's spouse, while the other half involve a child or some other close relative. There are a few documented instances involving remarkably close friends.
I can't find a source for this 50-50 split claim, but it is true that the earliest research in this area focused on spousal bereavement and close family relationships as a convenience. But none state that these are the only relationship where this occurs. Modern studies like Castelnuovo in 2015 argue that the actual trend is in the closeness of the relationship, not the nature of the relationship, pointing out, for example, that unhappy marriages rarely lead to such experiences.
In light of those facts, an appeal to bereavement hallucination is an insufficient hypothesis due to the fact that Peter is, number one, male.
While more female reports have been studied, Reese's study explicitly states that the total incidence of hallucination is similar for men and women. Gender doesn't disqualify anyone.
He's not of the appropriate age for the experience.
All ages experience bereavement hallucinations, despite being more prevalent in some ages. But more importantly, we have no idea how old Peter was when Jesus died. The Synoptic Gospels have Jesus healing Peter's mother-in-law. Clement of Alexandria says he had kids, and the Acts of Peter suggest his daughter was of fornication age in the time of the early church. That all very plausibly puts Peter in his 30s at the time, one of the prevalent age groups.
The post-bereavement hallucination idea, to me, the biggest issue with it is that it doesn't seem to me that if you hallucinate that someone you loved had, or rather, if you have a hallucination of someone that you love that has passed away, you're not going to come to the conclusion that they rose from the dead.
Studies by experts like Benthal, Edelman, and others consistently demonstrate that people experiencing hallucinations do not always recognize them as unreal. The research reveals a wide spectrum of insight, from those who firmly believe their experiences are completely external to those who understand they originate internally, with many falling in between the extremes. Whether someone recognizes a hallucination as false depends on cultural background, the vividness of the experience, personal beliefs, emotional state, and underlying medical conditions. The ability to distinguish real from hallucinatory experiences varies dramatically across individuals and circumstances, making blanket claims about universal insight both inaccurate and inconsistent with decades of empirical evidence. Modern studies of bereavement hallucinations began in 1971 and almost exclusively conducted in Western cultures, though the differences in a Japanese study are fascinating. In fact, several of the studies have extensive discussion about how uncomfortable the subjects are in discussing their experiences for fear of being judged. And various researchers are trying to propose alternate wording so that our Western linear thinking biases will stop getting in the way of people expressing themselves and editing what they say. Monophasic cultures, like modern Western societies, primarily value knowledge acquired during ordinary waking consciousness and tend to dismiss experiences from other states, such as dreams, visions, or trance states, as unreal or fictional. In contrast, polyphasic cultures derive knowledge from a diverse range of cognitive experiences, treating altered states of consciousness as equally legitimate sources of information and understanding. While people in polyphasic cultures can distinguish between ordinary perception and visionary experiences, they grant culturally approved visions the same reality status as waking perceptions. What Western societies label as hallucinations are viewed in these cultures as meaningful access points to different domains of reality rather than pathological events. Modern neurological research shows that visual and visionary perceptions register similarly in the brain, suggesting that distinguishing between real and unreal experiences may be more of a cultural construct than a fundamental neurological difference. We don't have time to get into the full case here, but few would challenge that first century Judea was a polyphasic culture. The Bible itself is littered with characters, including Peter and Paul, accepting visions as sources of insight.
I confirm that this is, in fact, the medical facts on the ground, that individuals that hallucinate would instantly lose their belief based on the social pressures.
There is research on techniques to help patients realize that their hallucinations are not real. This intervention-style therapy can be effective when posing hypothetical contradictions and verbal challenges. But all that assumes a scenario where the group makes a meaningful distinction between visions and reality and feels incentivized to intervene. Again, Second Temple Judaism was a polyphasic culture where dreams and visions were valued sources of information, and the idea that other disciples were aggressively pushing back on Peter is just monophasic, anachronistic speculation. Bennett and Bennett's 2000 study affirms that the hallucination experiencer will adopt a materialistic attitude when talking to non-affirming authorities. But the reverse is also true. They will further adopt a supernaturalist discourse when talking to people who are sympathetic toward the experience. So I guess we're just left to speculate and guess what kind of audience Peter encountered, affirming or hostile.
I've confirmed this with probably one of the most world's experts in hallucinations, Dr. Andrei Alexeyev.
Yeah, that's the same book I was referencing about intervention therapy.
We know scientifically and medically that typically, 9 times out of 10, hallucinations have to be consistent with our prior background knowledge and experience and cultural expectations, our sociological expectations and that sort of thing. Very, very rarely do we ever experience something that's counter to that, although there are some rare cases.
Could find no source whatsoever that quantifies 9 out of 10. I suspect this was a made-up number, though very willing to learn about his source. Siegel and West's Hallucinations textbook states that some bear little resemblance to the subject's previous experience. So expectation isn't a hard requirement. In history, Roman commander Drusus called off a desired invasion because of a vision of a woman of supernatural size.
Rodents of unusual size? I don't think they exist.
Muhammad's first encounter with Gabriel took him deeply, rather than inspiring him. Perhaps most poignantly, Emperor Constantine had a vision to carry a cross into battle, which he did, but only later learned the Christian significance of the shape. But honestly, the entire idea that risen Jesus was necessarily counter to Peter's expectations is built on nothing but speculation.
Lone hallucination wouldn't overturn Jewish theology. The Jews had this idea that the Messiah was going to be this conquer, that he was going to help the Jews to overthrow Rome. They had no conception that he would be God in the flesh, or that he would die on a cross and then come back 3 days later. That would have been total heresy.
Christian apologists need to stop espousing this embarrassingly wrong notion. The Jewish thought was uniform in its messianic expectations. Yes, Davidic warrior king was one school of thought, but the Dead Sea Scrolls describe what seems to be two messiahs, a priestly figure and a kingly figure. 1 Enoch and 4 Ezra look for a cosmic heavenly figure who executes divine judgment. Rabbinic Judaism allows for a teacher messiah to bring wisdom and spiritual renewal. Beyond the Essenes, the New Testament itself acknowledges Jewish subgroups with competing beliefs, like the Pharisees, Sadducees, Herodians, and Zealots. There was no monolithic agreement on what was or wasn't heresy.
So Peter's coming saying, hey, I saw Jesus. He rose individually before the end of the world, unlike our Jewish beliefs.
Matthew, Mark, and Luke all record that people thought Jesus might be John the Baptist raised from the dead. So obviously, individual resurrection was an open possibility for Jews in Jesus' time. Again, treating Second Temple Judaism like a monolith is just as big a mistake as treating modern Christianity like a monolith. This is only modestly better than the worst objection of all.
This theory directly contradicts the Gospel of John and its resurrection appearances.
We have this great saying that Jesus was seen by many people, 500. He was shown to the 12. He was seen by by James, the brother of Christ, which I just talked about. So Jesus appeared to many, not just Peter. The New Testament authors would have been lying. And what I mean by that is the New Testament authors all say that Jesus was seen by multiple people.
Not that I'd have the slightest problem in saying that the New Testament authors were lying, if by lying you meant inventing details. That said, I think it's equally likely they were writing down stories that they had good faith reason to think might be true. To drive home his psychology point, Dale derailed the stream with a long side quest.
I just want to play a little 10-minute clip from Joseph Berger on addressing the mass hallucination hypothesis, because he is a clinical psychologist and a proven medical expert.
This is not germane to the discussion of minimal witnesses, since minimal witnesses doesn't posit mass hallucinations. But I mention it because it seems Dale may have let the clip play longer than he wanted.
Is it okay if I just kind of ask you a question that's related to what you're saying here? So, granted, with group collective hallucinations, they don't happen in the sense that no one's having identical hallucinations kind of thing, but they can have similar hallucinations through like explaining to people, like, oh, I saw Jesus or something. It's some kind of social contagion like that. If somebody said, I saw Jesus or something, could that create the expectation where they would have similar enough hallucinations? Or what's your take on something like that?
I don't know. That kind of ventures into a speculative sort of discussion. I think similarity does not equate to sameness.
Yeah. Fair enough. All right, cool. So continue on. I didn't want to interrupt. I just wanted to get your take on something like that.
No, carry on. I'm not sure. I think I was kind of done with that.
Well, oops. Dr. Berger acknowledged that individual hallucinations could indeed be harmonized enough to cause a social contagion. 6. James, the brother of Jesus, became part of Peter's Jesus movement, perhaps also one of the disciples named John.
Peter was in no position to convince anybody. He literally denied Jesus Christ 3 times, and he was basically gone and in shame.
Well, that deny Christ stuff is... So I'm not putting any weight on that.
I don't know that Peter would be a professional orator or some sort of salesman extraordinaire.
While I don't think the book of Acts is reliable, the panel does, and Acts represents Peter as giving a speech that convinced 3,000 people in Acts 2, another speech that convinced thousands in Acts 3, and he won the first Gentile converts with his words in Acts 10. By your own lore, Peter is a pretty convincing speaker. Why is it plausible that thousands came to believe because of his testimony alone? But it's so crazy implausible that Peter,
he was kind of like the leader before this,
could convince 2 with his testimony.
I think that that's really incredibly difficult to believe that he would be able to do that.
You'll have to explain to me the difference of why testimony was good enough for people who never met Jesus, but it's silly to think that two people who knew him would be immune to believing because of testimony. Or is this just your intuition again?
If Peter hallucinated, why did James convert? Because James was the brother of Jesus Christ.
Well, if you're a Protestant, sure. Catholics make up a big swath of Christians, and you haven't convinced them on this.
And James was a skeptic of Jesus Christ. We learn that in the Gospels.
We know from the historical sources that James was originally skeptical, or at the very least ambivalent towards his brother.
First, and second, do we? It's not at all clear that the group in Mark 3, verses 31 to 35, who say that Jesus is out of his mind, is intended to be the same group mentioned in Mark 3:21. And worse yet, while some translate the group in verse 21 to be family, King James calls them friends, and scholars like Painter thinks it's better translated to be associates, which the NIV version also admits in a footnote. So that's inconclusive. John 7:5 says, his own brothers did not believe him, but it's hugely ambiguous which brothers and the nature of this unbelief. Was this incomplete understanding, a subject-specific dispute, outright rejection? A few chapters later, the author of John uses the same word to say that the disciples did not believe Jesus. And Daniel definitely doesn't want to call the 12 skeptics of Christ.
And then all of a sudden, here comes one of Jesus' followers, and he's saying, hey, he rose from the dead. Would you believe that, just taking Peter's word for it, and commit your entire life and ultimately die a martyr's death because Peter said that Jesus rose from the dead? Would you do that? The answer is absolutely not.
He's not going to take some rustic fisherman's word for it.
James likely believed in Jesus' resurrection through Peter's testimony due to a convergence of psychological, social, and cultural factors. As Jesus' brother, James faced devastating shame from his siblings' crucifixion, Rome's most degrading punishment that tarnished entire families, making Peter's resurrection claims an attractive path to restore his family's honor and vindicate Jesus as divinely chosen rather than a criminal. The first century Jewish apocalyptic worldview already accepted resurrection as plausible, especially for righteous individuals, while the polyphasic culture validated extraordinary spiritual experiences across different states of consciousness. James likely experienced cognitive dissonance after Jesus' death, creating psychological pressure to accept explanations that preserve meaning, and Peter's charismatic authority as movement leader would have made his testimony particularly compelling. Additionally, joining the movement offered James practical benefits. It positioned him as the honored brother of the risen Christ rather than a crucified criminal's relative, potentially restoring his relationship with his mother Mary, and allowed him to resume natural leadership as Jesus' successor while maintaining his Jewish identity and law-observant reputation that history agrees even non-Christian Jews respected of James. But your incredulity is noted.
Paulogia's thing, to save time, I won't play it, but he makes this big deal about this where Gary Habermas says, well, what was the reason James converted? Well, most likely because he had a resurrection appearance. That was the cause. And Paulogia, most likely, like he makes this big deal that's so ridiculous to.
The big deal was because Gary puts forth a sentence with the phrase most likely as a fact to be agreed with. Saying Janus most likely had tea doesn't somehow make Janus had tea a fact. Just like you would agree, crucifixion victims were most likely left to rot doesn't automatically translate to Jesus was left to rot. You see how that works?
All we know is that James converted. It doesn't say, well, James converted because he had a resurrection appearance, but come on, put 2 and 2 together.
It doesn't say James converted because it was a good way to restore his family honor, which it did, but come on, put 2 and 2 together.
Seems pretty straightforward. I think he's working on, I think he'd probably say the same thing about us, but it seems like he's basing this whole thing on a series of assumptions.
That is correct. I would say the same of you. Good self-awareness. 7. Stories about Jesus spread through person-to-person evangelism, with the focus on recruiting new followers rather than accurately transmitting historical events. Nathan made slides for this.
So I want to defend the Gospels as rather formal, controlled traditions. So basically the exact opposite of what Paulogia thinks. There's a creed in 1 Corinthians 15, and basically this creed dates to the 30s. according to most scholars.
Well, according to evangelical scholars, which seems to be based entirely on vibes. The only thing a person can say for sure is that it predates 1 Corinthians, written in the 50s. The rest is speculation and wishes.
Even if we give skeptics all the dates they want, they're still going to have this issue that there's a creed in the 30s that is identical or very similar to what the Gospels say in the grand narrative of the story, that shows that there was not this growing ahistorical mythological element over time, because their stories are consistent.
In 1977, this scene first appeared on movie screens.
You fought in the Clone Wars? Yes. I was once a Jedi Knight, the same as your father.
22 years later, 3 new prequel movies began to be released, followed by 133 episodes of Clone Wars television, all remarkably consistent with that first little creed from 1977.
No, my father didn't fight in the wars. He was a navigator on a spice freighter.
That's what your uncle told you. He didn't hold with your father's ideals, thought he should have stayed here and not gotten involved. You fought in the Clone Wars? Yes. I was once a Jedi Knight, the same as your father. He was the best star pilot in the galaxy. And a cunning warrior. And he was a good friend. What is it? Your father's lightsaber. For over 1,000 generations, the Jedi Knights were the guardians of peace and justice in the Old Republic. Before the Dark Times. Before the Empire. A young Jedi named Darth Vader, who was a pupil of mine until he turned to evil, helped the Empire hunt down and destroy the Jedi Knights. He betrayed and murdered your father. Now the Jedi are all but extinct.
Just as in the decades that followed Star Wars: A New Hope, new creators and thousands of new details were voluntarily constrained to adhere to the original skeleton outline that the audience had already committed to memory and expectation. So, too, it is unsurprising that the oral traditions and later Gospels about Jesus would also adhere to the rough skeleton of a well-known early formulation. I mean, the entire body disposal narrative in the early creed is just 3 words. He was buried. That ballooned into a whole convoluted narrative about Joseph of Arimathea and his fluid credentials and wealth and association in order to answer audience questions about why what usually happened to crucified bodies somehow didn't happen to Jesus.
The teaching of Jesus and his followers contradicts the idea that this is growing over time. So I'll explain what I mean here. So Jesus taught in what is called kriya. This is a Greek word, and all it means is a useful anecdote.
A full discussion here would need its own video, but suffice to say that scholars point to this same thing as reason to reject these teachings as going back to Jesus, because he would have been speaking in Aramaic, and the clever features are in the translation to Greek. It'd be very odd to be concerned about preserving the exact words of Jesus, but not preserve them in the original language.
What you'll see is they use a lot of alliteration, hyperbole, rhyming.
Alliteration and rhyming doesn't survive translation. Scholars like E.P. Sanders, Richard Horsley, Amy Jill Levine, Geza Vermes, and others think Jesus' teachings are better classified as Jewish wisdom rather than Greek Sharia. Dale Allison, Bart Ehrman, and Robin Faith Walsh are among those who note that these passages must have had editorial shaping at some point, perhaps even at the point of writing, and it tells us more about the editors than about Jesus. The Jesus of the Gospels never advocates for memorization, so this is whole cloth speculation without general buy-in. Speculation is fine, but it's just one possible interpretation.
So Matthew and Luke, it's pretty consistent in scholarship that they use Mark as a source.
The writing of Mark is basically the end of the oral tradition phase, so what happens after that doesn't impact what happened before, though I also disagree with your premise. And his last point about Papias?
Whenever someone comes into his town that knew Matthew or knew Mark or knew Luke or any of the disciples, he wants to talk to them. He basically says, I only want information if you've spoken to the disciples yourselves.
Anytime we can fact check Papias, he's wrong. So this doesn't impress me personally, but also he would have been a child when Mark was being written. So his later alleged personal purity standards don't reflect on what the generation before him were up to.
8. Paul, a Pharisee who had been persecuting the new Christians out of a sincere belief that he was serving God, experienced a non-veridical vision of the allegedly resurrected Jesus.
In terms of the two skeptics, Paul and James, so he does give a full account of Paul. I do have some issues with him calling it a vision versus an appearance because Paul is clear the early church knows a distinction and difference.
Paul describes himself as having had visions and revelations in Galatians 1 and 2, 1 Corinthians 11, and 2 Corinthians 12. In this last one, he reiterates he doesn't actually know if he was in or out of his body. If you want to trust Acts, Paul's companions don't see and hear exactly what he sees. So Jesus obviously wasn't standing there in bodily form. Then Paul proceeds to have more visions in chapters 9, 16, 18, 22, and 27. If you have issues with Paul having visions, your fight is not with me. We already talked about this, but first century Judea was a polyphasic culture. To some extent, they may have known the difference, but more importantly, they didn't much care about the difference.
Furthermore, the accusation of post-traumatic stress disorder is dependent upon experiences defined by personal trauma.
That's correct. PTSD arises from exposure to traumatic events,
and is usually correlated with pre-existing anxiety disorders or tendencies.
While some individuals with pre-existing mental health vulnerabilities may be at higher risk for PTSD, it is not usually dependent on them. Many people with no prior history of anxiety develop PTSD following trauma. Pre-existing conditions are a risk factor, but not a requirement.
Furthermore, the symptoms of PTSD include, but are not limited to, destructive and self-destructive behavior.
In 2 Corinthians 11, Paul describes his life. I have worked much harder, been in prison more frequently, been flogged more severely, been exposed to death again and again. 5 times I received from the Jews the 40 lashes minus 1. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was pelted with stones. 3 times I was shipwrecked. I spent a night and a day in the open sea. I've been constantly on the move. I've been in danger from rivers, danger from bandits, in danger from my fellow Jews, in danger from Gentiles, in danger in the city, in danger in the country, in danger at sea, and in danger from false believers. I've labored and I've toiled and I've gone without sleep. I've known hunger and thirst and I've gone without food. I've been cold and naked. Nah, that doesn't sound like self-destructive behavior at all.
Hypervigilance.
In 1 Corinthians 9, Paul describes his level of focus. Do you not know that in a race all runners run, but only one gets the prize? Run in such a way as to get the prize. Everyone who competes in the games goes into strict training. They do it to get a crown that will not last, but we do it to get a crown that will last forever. Therefore, I do not run like someone running aimlessly. I do not fight like a boxer beating the air. No, I strike a blow to my body and make it my slave, so that after I have preached to others, I myself will not be disqualified for the prize. Nah, that doesn't sound like hypervigilance at all.
None of which are evident in the material we have present.
My bad.
Paul, before his conversion to Christ, would have felt absolutely no guilt or shame for what he was doing, because what he was doing was morally justified.
Paul was not experiencing guilt, okay? This is very important. He was literally on his way to kill more Christians when he saw the risen Christ. Okay, he was on his way to Damascus to kill more Christians. This was not a man that was feeling guilty.
Soldiers, peace officers, or religious enforcers often act under orders, duty, or belief systems that they see as morally correct at the time. However, later reflection, new moral frameworks, or empathic realization of harm done can lead to deep guilt, shame, intrusive thoughts, and distress. Hallmarks of moral injury, often overlapping with PTSD. Many have acted in compliance with military rules and expectations, legally and morally justified within their culture, yet still experience devastating psychological consequences afterward. They may feel guilt over collateral damage, dehumanization, or the realization that the enemy was human too. People involved in systems like apartheid, genocide, or religious persecution often believe they're doing the right thing, yet later deconstruct those beliefs and are haunted by what they did. Just following orders or believe that was right at the time does not prevent guilt and trauma. In fact, it can intensify it when the moral framework later shifts.
Furthermore, his vision resulted in actual blindness for 3 days. And this is not something that a mere hallucination would cause. Think about that.
None of that is in Paul's own letters. It's just in single source, historically unreliable Acts.
9. Paul met Peter and John, but they didn't see eye to eye.
He was accepted by the two prominent leaders of Christianity. Why? Obviously, they compared notes. So whatever Paul said to James and to Peter was incredibly compelling, and they accepted him in. So I think that this is incredibly convincing and compelling evidence that Paul also saw the risen Christ. And it wasn't just Paul and it wasn't just Peter, it was also James.
Yeah, there's a specific line in Galatians where he says, they added nothing to my message. And it's like, so they were in complete agreement on what they saw, what they believed.
This is the laziest possible reading of Galatians, allowing apologists to set the table for you so you're primed to see harmony. It starts with Paul asserting his authority, insisting that no humans contributed to him, just Jesus. He curses anyone who differs with him. He insists again that his gospel is from Revelation, not these other apostles, and he consulted with none of them. He undermines them, saying they merely seemed to be pillars. They eventually have to split the preaching territories in a handshake deal. Then Paul confronts Peter publicly, because Peter was capitulating to overly conservative James. And it all ends with hypocrisy accusations. This whole passage is tense, not harmonious.
10. Several decades later, Greek-speaking individuals who had never met Jesus or Peter began documenting these circulating stories about Jesus, the sayings attributed to him, and their interpretations of these narratives.
Nathan has slides for this one too, but I'm just going to point you to my Who Really Wrote the Gospels video, which covers the topic in a much better fashion than we can late in this long video.
You're going to have to explain how, within living memory of the apostles, while some of them were still alive, these accounts are being written in Judea, being spread around all over the Roman Empire, and none of the 12 had anything to say about it, and none of the 12 corrected it.
Yes. 50 years later, Bartholomew comes to town after being absent from Christianity the whole time, and someone's reading their brand new copy of Matthew, long after Peter and James are dead. Old Bartholomew says, "Hey, I'm Bartholomew, and that's not how it happened." Will the congregation take his word and immediately stop believing? Or will they condescendingly say, "Sure you are, Grandpa. I bet you and Jesus were good pals," while patting him on the head and sending him out the door?
11. Occasionally, some early Christians engaged in disruptive behavior and faced consequences as a result.
No, dude. Nero, he had Peter and Paul killed. James was killed. He was stoned at the church in Jerusalem.
Okay, quick tip here. Listing a few of the occasional times that I already grant isn't going to refute the larger point. And don't miss the observation that it's generally for disruptive behavior or manufactured disruptive behavior and nothing at all to do with theology or ideology.
I mean, I don't know if he's lying or just incredibly ignorant, but we have really good reason to think that the early Christians were being killed quite often. I mean, Paul was literally killing Christians. And Paul was later martyred. Peter was martyred.
Yep, that's just the same example again.
We have a really good record that the early Christian leaders, all of them except John, were martyred. That's what the tradition says.
No, this is a huge mistake. Don't say that anymore for your own sake.
I think there's also been a hyper trust by many Christians who read martyrs and says, hey, they all died as martyrs, and they proclaim it. Well, I've made that claim in the past, so I repent on this show from making that before I did my research. That should be corrected as well.
Oh, yeah. We also have no testimony that any of the apostles ever recanted.
And no testimony that any eyewitness of risen Jesus was ever given a chance to recant. So I guess it's just silence all around for everyone that proves nothing.
12. Centuries later, in 303 AD, Christianity was temporarily outlawed in Rome, but it gained legal protection 10 years later and soon became the Roman Empire's first official religion.
Actually, that's not true. The Christianity never became the official religion of the Roman Empire. It just gained legal protection, and Constantine became Christian. This is a very popular online myth.
Welcome back to A Moment in History. I'm Seth Udinsky. Well, in this segment, friends, let's go back to the twilight of the Roman Empire, where in 379 AD, Theodosius I became emperor of the Eastern Empire. Now, historians usually recognize Theodosius's predecessor, Constantine the Great, as the first, quote, Christian emperor of Rome. But under Constantine in the early 4th century, Christianity was merely legalized. So basically, Christians no longer needed to fear being burned at the stake or being fed to the lions for their faith. Theodosius, however, took the next step. He declared Christianity to be the official, unquestioned state religion of the empire in 381.
Oops. Sorry, guys. Maybe look up Edict of Thessalonica. Okay, that's enough for now. I hope you've learned some important ways not to respond to minimal witnesses hypothesis if you actually intend an intellectually honest critique. If you just want to shout,
That's not even from the Bible.
That's not what the Bible says.
Because it's not in the Bible.
Really? Then by all means have your fun comparison time, like a kid playing a spot the differences in the pictures game. It'll be about as meaningful as that. Every possible alternative to Christianity's narrative must necessarily contradict what the Bible says. So if what the Bible says is your standard by which you evaluate alternatives, then you're not actually engaged in the process of evaluation. You're just affirming a presupposition, and you've told on yourself. At least Gary Habermas tried to make a case without assuming the Gospels. It didn't work, but I respect that he understood that he needed to try. All right, panelists, any final thoughts?
Yeah, I really think that this theory is, frankly, just very, very lazy.
Because it's easy to take a 1-minute clip and just use that to critique someone.
Let's say Paulogia had to assume that crucifixions didn't happen in Rome or something like that, when we know that they did.
But Paul, as usual, he just throws caution to the wind and dives headlong into the argument.
You're reading the accounts and you're like, man, why are these guys such idiots when you're reading about these disciples?
He's kind of just capitalizing in this case, capitalizing on Gary's hard work for 14 years.
The first hypothesis is that Jesus Christ actually rose from the dead, and that's what explains the facts. And the second hypothesis is that a fish swam in the Mediterranean and got swallowed by a shark.
Sometimes history can tell us causation, but sometimes that issue is even debatable amongst historical sources.
In order for Paul's theory to not work, this person must not have a car. Now, that's not one of the initial facts.
They were fishermen, speaking of the disciples. They were probably heard a lot of fish tales that they didn't believe. I imagine them to be rather skeptical men.
And the theory completely fails with everything else that we know about the actual case and literally contradicts our historical record and all the other evidence.
Well, those are all really good points. Something to think about for sure. Thank you so much for watching, and if you're willing and able to help with the mission of this channel, I greatly appreciate you becoming a patron or a member. Link in the description. Then tap on the thumbnail on screen now, and I'll see you over there. Until next time, later.